Welcome to a Shot in the Arm podcast. I'm your host, Ben Plumley, and this is a podcast about global health and human rights. It's brought to you in partnership with the Bay Area Global Health Alliance, a group of companies from tech and biotech, non-profits and community organizations located in the San Francisco Bay Area, and all committed to improving the lives and health of people around the world. It's also brought to you in special partnership with Roche Molecular Sciences. Now, this is World AIDS Day, and it's that time of the year when we remember the huge impact that perhaps one of the first zoonotic infections has had on humanity in the modern age. That is to say, HIV, like SARS-CoV-2, originated in animals and jumped into humans. And with HIV, we know that, certainly for the time being, we've been able kind of to control the virus through the use of antiretroviral treatment. Well, here we are at the end of 2020, and we're seeing that there is some interesting scientific data coming out about vaccines. We've seen the Pfizer data. Well, we've seen hints of it. There's Moderna, there's AstraZeneca, and in a couple of weeks there will be the emergence of data from Johnson & Johnson. So many things to be excited about. But perhaps one of the things that is most intriguing about this year and the impact of COVID-19 has been the way that the world's attention has been turned to diagnostics. And in fact, it's diagnostics that we're going to focus on in this episode. We're going to be talking to Dr. Paul Baum, who is the head of clinical sciences at Roche Molecular, and he's also an associate professor at the University of San Francisco in California. So Paul, welcome to a Shot in the Arm podcast.
Thanks, Ben. Great to be here.
Well, a real pleasure to have you here. Now, Paul, you have a fascinating career. You are an infectious disease specialist with a particular interest in diagnostics. How did you get to this point? What grabbed you about diagnostics?
Well, maybe I'll start with infectious diseases. It's been a really fascinating field, in part because we understand a lot of the pathogenesis of disease. There's so many other areas of medicine where we actually don't really understand why people get sick. In infectious diseases, it's usually pretty clear. And in part, that really makes diagnostics an important part of the field because we know what we're looking for. We know that we can understand the cause of disease and monitor patients being treated for disease. So diagnostics is really, for anyone in infectious disease, is a really central part of the discipline.
As we are learning in COVID-19 these days as well, diagnostics has this central place. But for people who don't know, I mean, many of our listeners and viewers will know Roche Molecular from its collaboration with the Clinton Health Access Initiative on early infant diagnosis and dry blood spot technology that you've used in Southern Africa. But what does Roche Molecular do? What's its area of interests?
So our focus is primarily on PCR technology. So we are basically making diagnostic tests that look for the genetic information in organisms, DNA or RNA. We have some other technologies as well, but the core technology is PCR.
And what is PCR?
So PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction. It's a Nobel Prize winning discovery that basically allows us to take one piece of DNA or RNA and amplify it to many times that. So it's actually one of the most sensitive diagnostic technologies there are because it basically can detect as little as one molecule.
And that basically, for the lay audience, tells you whether you have the virus, whatever the virus is. That tells you that there's a piece of that infectious agent in your body.
That's right. So we are able, in the case of coronavirus, for example, to find the virus and say whether this virus nucleic acid or genetic material is present or not. In some cases, like we do for HIV, we can make the test quantitative as well. So it's not just saying whether something's present or absent, but saying how much is there.
Yeah. And I guess when COVID hit at the beginning of 2020, How difficult was it for you guys to sort of turn on a coin and then devote your attention to this new coronavirus?
Well, it's never easy, but we were in a very good position to respond. So we had a couple of things in our favor. The first is that we knew that there would be some sort of pandemic coming down the road. For people in infectious diseases, the question about pandemics is not if they will happen, but when. So we had actually started in 2018 to look at our pandemic response and to look at how we could potentially do a better job and get tests available faster. So we set up a team to look at how we would monitor outbreaks, how we would make the decision to respond, and then how we would get the actual tests produced and distributed as quickly as possible. So that's one thing. The second thing in our favor is that we actually have a very well characterized instrument and assay system for PCR. So we have a lot of reagents that are used in all of our assays. And we have computer software that allows us to take the genetic sequences of organisms and very quickly design assays that are very likely to work well in the laboratory. So this can compress what used to take maybe a year into literally weeks to come up with an assay. So it's both organizational and technological advances that helped us respond.
As well as preparation. I mean, many of us thought the big one, the next big infectious disease outbreak, was going to be some version of the influenza virus. And so we were a bit surprised that it was a coronavirus. Did that have any impact on you, or were you not so surprised?
We had been thinking about it. I mean, I think, in hindsight, SARS and MERS were forerunners, also coronavirus epidemics. So we had been looking at coronavirus. But the nice thing about PCR is basically any virus or any bacteria, any fungus, they all use the same nucleic acids as part of their genetic structure. And that means we can design assays to detect any of those kinds of organisms.
So perhaps the silver lining in the cloud, if you like, for 2020 has been that it's really accentuated our interest in diagnostics. You know, I remember working, I suppose, for decades in trying to promote access to HIV treatment around the world. And it was very hard to get people's interests into, that first stage, the diagnostic. It was the sort of the ugly stepsister of HIV treatment. And yet things have completely changed this year, almost to the point where we've sort of almost thought of good and cheap and easy diagnostics as a magic bullet. But that isn't the case at all. And I know that you and many others working in the diagnostic space have spoken about the tests and the range of tests as being part of a solution, part of a continuum. And I wondered if you could just sort of reflect a bit on that.
Yeah, so diagnostic tests, obviously, by themselves are not the solution. It's important to figure out how you're going to manage the patients. And honestly, even in the absence of a specific treatment, managing the patients can be a challenge, as we see with Ebola historically. And then we also need to obviously work towards vaccines, and there's been a lot of very promising news on that front recently. But the need for diagnostics doesn't go away. So even if we are successfully rolling out vaccines across the world, which will probably take a couple of years in the best case scenario, I don't think anyone seriously thinks that we will eradicate coronavirus. It's been difficult enough to eradicate smallpox. And really, we're going to have to live with coronavirus. And so diagnostics will continue to play a role in helping us figure out emerging areas of epidemics and making sure that those are quickly addressed wherever they occur in the world.
So it reminds me, Paul, of the very early days of HIV treatment. And you may recall that I was working for the late Ambassador Richard Holbrooke in getting companies to scale up HIV services, and he was really obsessed by HIV testing. And his view was that, you get people tested, and if they're positive, you put them on treatment, and if they're negative, you put them on condoms, as it were. And the reality is so much more complicated. And here we are in 2020, COVID-19, and I'm working with a number of authorities, in particular the territory of Guam, trying to work out what the particular balance of PCR, of antigen and antibody tests, the balance of point of care and lab tests, and it's really quite complicated. And I think one of the things that would be really helpful to understand more is that I think many of us lay people think of antigen and antibody tests as essentially the same thing, but they're not, are they?
No, they're pretty different. From a clinical point of view, it's actually the PCR test and the antigen test that are more similar. And they're more similar because both of them are looking to detect parts of the virus. And so they're basically telling you whether the virus is present or absent. And the antibody test is actually different because the antibody test is looking not for the virus directly, but for the immune response against the virus. And so it tells you that someone has been exposed to the virus, or in the future may be useful to tell us that someone's been immunized and has a successful immune response against the virus.
One of the trends, I guess it's been happening a fair amount over the last few years, but this year has really accelerated it, is the move to self-care. And obviously, as many of us in the industrialized world shelter in place, the individual, the patient having more control over their all aspects of their exposure with other people, including healthcare workers, is to be welcomed. But it also has applicability for the Global South, which doesn't have the kind of intense infrastructure that would otherwise be needed. And, whether it's laboratories or, trained healthcare professionals all on site. And so I wonder, particularly given Roche's heritage in laboratory-based testing, what's your sense of the trend towards self-care and more tests being done at home?
So self-care is an important trend, as you say, Ben, and it's really important both in low resource settings as well as globally. So the value of being able to collect one's own specimen, for example, is not just convenient for a patient, but can also potentially really make the system work better. So if you think about what it takes to collect a nasal swab in a clinical setting, there's gowning and masking involved. So if the patient can collect his or her own specimen, that can really make things much more efficient and save a lot of money. And then bringing the test to the where the patient or person is also obviously very important. And as we see in Africa right now for HIV testing, it's really a mixture of different technologies that allow us to bring HIV testing to the patient. And we expect to see similar trends with coronavirus as well. There are obviously limits to self-testing. So one of the difficult things about coronavirus is patients can become gravely ill without a lot of warning. They can have very low oxygen in their blood and suddenly crash. So people won't be able to completely manage coronavirus in their home, but we can certainly go a long way towards diagnosis at home and give people the tools to complement the healthcare system.
And I think, a particular challenge for us is around people with who are asymptomatic, have no symptoms, and who may be at risk of spreading. And clearly diagnostics are going to have a major impact there. I was wondering, as we look both about vaccines, you mentioned this earlier, Paul, we've seen a really rapid acceleration of research and attention. And I wonder, you sort of referred to it earlier, but as the world and the scientists at Roche Molecular turned their attention to COVID-19, were there particular things, to the extent you're able to answer this, were there particular things up your sleeve that you were able to adapt quickly? Or was this sort of almost a sort of all hands on deck? We really need to just push here in ways we haven't done before.
Yeah, so it definitely was all hands on deck. People have been working very hard to meet the need for diagnostics, but we did have several things in our favor. So as I mentioned before, we do have a very well characterized diagnostic platform, which means that we were able to design a test that was going to work well very quickly. And we're able to manufacture it also very quickly because a lot of the reagents that we use in our products can be shared from assay to assay. So we had those factors in our favor. But still, a lot of work to scale up manufacturing, which is at levels we had never previously reached, and a lot of effort from a lot of people to make the tests available.
And then sort of downstream, we also see regulatory bodies responding to this crisis. And, we're all talking about the FDA's emergency authorization process. And we've, just now we're seeing it with the availability of a treatment for those that are quite sick, the Regeneron, and the outgoing president of the United States had that, and he arranged for some sort of compassionate use to go to the outgoing HUD secretary, Ben Carson. And that's terrific. That's absolutely wonderful. And it does speak to the kind of flexibility, particularly that I think was driven by the AIDS movement in the early days, to make sure that we had access to products, medicines, and diagnostics when we had emergencies. But do you think that what we're learning now should become, part of the pantheon, part of the normal way of doing things, or are these kind of rapid approvals really more relevant to emergency situations?
Yeah, I think for the most part, Ben, I think these are really limited to emergency situations. So when the FDA sets up an emergency use authorization pathway, they very deliberately lower the bar. They ask for less validation, less evidence of clinical effectiveness than would normally be required to get a product approved. And they're doing that because they know it takes time to do a thorough job at this, and they need to get a diagnostic test available. Even there has to be some balance, right? So you want a test to be available as quickly as possible, but you want to make sure it has at least some accuracy, some worth, and will help patients rather than hurt them. So I would say we really do need to limit this to areas of emergencies and do a more thorough job of validating and reviewing diagnostics where it's not an emergency. However, I would say one of the real pluses of the emergency use authorization experience is FDA's real effort to work interactively with manufacturers, whether this is town halls or answering questions literally within hours, to help the products get through the process as quickly as possible. So I think that collaboration has been very positive, and I hope that continues even after the pandemic has resolved.
One of the things that's sort of quite interesting in the way Roche has approached things is it's been its commitment to partnerships. And we spoke about this earlier with the Clinton Health Access Initiative work in Southern Africa on early infant diagnosis. And Roche has also been working with public health authorities in South and Southeast Asia, and I've certainly been a part of those collaborations. And that principle of collaboration is at the heart of the work that the Bay Area Global Health Alliance does, which is a partner on these podcasts. And as we enter this sort of era of pandemics literacy, I wondered, Paul, if you could comment on just what the value of partnerships are in, building our scientific knowledge, but also then implementing that and sort of helping broaden the access to the fruits of our scientific collaboration.
Yeah, so partnerships have been very important to us for HIV in some of the ways that you mentioned, and in others as well. So we've, for example, partnered with PEPFAR to create a training lab for diagnostic testing in Johannesburg, South Africa. So this partnership is just an example of where we can work together to make sure that the Sub-Saharan Africa has access to the laboratory expertise that's needed to bring diagnostics to people who need them. And scientific collaboration is very important as well. We wouldn't be able to design a good coronavirus test, for example, if researchers around the world didn't make coronavirus genetic sequences available freely and rapidly to allow us to design the test according to those sequences. And then, as you mentioned, in implementation, Roche really has benefited from the expertise of CHI and other organizations to help bring HIV diagnostic tests to people who need them, as well as collaborations with other institutions.
Yeah, and again, all credit again to the early infant diagnosis work that, was able, through the use of dried blood spots, to get tests or to get samples very rapidly collected. I mean, maybe the technology has moved on, maybe it hasn't, but I thought that was a really winning combination. Now, Roche Molecular is part of the multinational Roche Corporation, which is headquartered in Basel in Switzerland. And I just wondered, what has the experience been like of working from home, sheltering in place in clinical science, which is essentially a multi-team, multidisciplinary effort? How have you all managed to do that? And are there any experiences that you think would be helpful for large or small companies that are struggling to keep going at the moment?
Yeah. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we do have a significant number of people who can't work from home. These are the people working in research labs, doing clinical studies, and doing manufacturing to make our products available, both on the diagnostics and on the pharmaceutical side. But as you mentioned, a lot of people, certainly in our function, clinical science, as well as the majority of people at Roche, we are working from home. And this for us has been really a cultural shift. Roche was one of these companies where we were really expected to meet in person wherever possible. And because we're based in different countries, we're often flying around the world in order to have those meetings. And so I think most of us have been pleasantly surprised by how well a lot of the digital tools for meeting have worked, including digital collaboration tools, but also just routine conferences. And one of the things that I never really thought about, but someone mentioned the other day, is usually we would have meetings and maybe 80% of the people would be in the room and then one or two people calling in. And that was always really hard to manage. And now everyone's on the same footing. They're all participating from home. And it's actually a lot easier to make sure that everyone is included in the meeting and all the ideas and suggestions are heard. So in some ways, it's actually been quite advantageous for us as a company.
Yeah, I think it is. Humans adapt, and we adapt to different circumstances. But I do think there are benefits. I mean, I'm seeing it here. Just stuck at home working. You won't notice it now, but normally beside me, I have two dogs. And they're normally very well behaved during the course of the day. But when I start having conference calls at 5 or 6 o'clock, that's truly witching hour, and I can get deeply disturbed. So I'm glad they're not with us at the moment. So, just one final question, Paul. How have you and your family coped? What's kept you sane? It's a question I ask all our guests, but really interested to know how you're holding it together, and any suggestions you have for binge watching.
Well, I would say one of my major activities has been walking. So I've been using walking to get around, but also getting to know the city. And I've lived in San Francisco for 20 years, but I'm really discovering some new areas of the city I had never seen before. So that's been a lot of fun. And I would say the one other thing that I've taken from the pandemic, if you will, is some existential truth. So a lot of us have had these things that we had on our list to do if we ever got around to it, if we ever had the time to do it, whether it's cleaning out an attic or reading a long novel or organizing photos. So this is the opportunity for those of us who are sheltering in place. And so it's actually been really useful. You find out what are the things you actually are going to be able to do and what are the things you probably won't do. And then you can use that to plan your life around that.
So dare I ask, any very long 19th century novels or treatises that you've been dipping into over this year?
So I've been starting Remembrance of Things Past. I think that's quite a long one, but I haven't made it all the way through. So we'll see how I do for the rest of the year.
Oh my gosh, that's really something to take on. Well, Paul, thank you so much for being on a Shot in the Arm podcast. We really appreciate it. And thanks to you and your colleagues for all the hard work you're doing. And, you really, really clearly see the impact that you are having on lives right around the world right now. You have our huge gratitude, and we wish you all well as we enter this next phase of the pandemic. Paul, you are a shot in the arm.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, that's it for this episode. Thank you very much to Dr. Paul Baum. Thank you to Sarah Anderson and everyone at the Bay Area Global Health Alliance. And thanks to Erica Spera, our director and producer from Newsdoc Media. And finally, thanks to you. As always, we'd love to know what you thought of this episode, and if you have any suggestions about future episodes, you know where to find us. We are at Twitter and Facebook at ShotArm Podcast, and you can find this and all other episodes on the podcast provider of your choice. So, it just remains for me to wish you a safe and a healthy week. And don't forget, let's see if I can do this properly. Don't forget to wear your mask.